There are two kinds of scars. The old women in Lena's neighborhood said, the ones that shout and the ones that whisper. The first kind are the marks you can point to: blackened skin, a crooked limb, a limp that calls attention like an unfair bell. The second kind hides beneath the heel, in the hollow of the chest, in the way a person learns to measure their breath when a door slams or smoke smells in the street. Lena carried both. One lived in the strap of her leather cane. The other lived in the small, quiet places where she kept herself steady. At 19, she had been all elbows and sun, her hair a tangle, her hands always sticky with syrup from the stall where her mother mended linens and sold sweet buns. She had been quick to laugh and quicker to move, a merchant's daughter who knew how to bargain and who, on a market morning that emptied like a heart being hollowed, sprinted into a burning house because a child's cry sounded like her own name. She had run without thinking. She had come out with 3 children clutched to her chest and a leg that no longer obeyed the angle it had been made to hold. The fire happened in a breath. Lena remembered the heat as a living thing, how it shoved and licked, how it bent the world into orange and the sound into a single long animal noise. She remembered the second-floor stair giving way and the fall that made the bones sing. She remembered a boy's small hand in hers and then the hard, clean pain that told her she had damaged something that would not return to its original shape. The town called her brave. The town called her foolish. The town gave her a nickname that smelled of tobacco and pity: the girl who saved lives. Pity sat like a shawl over Lena's family, heavy and itchy. Her mother set extra bowls for visitors and pressed silver into her fingers. Her father, Marcus, who once stood with a merchant's blunt pride, bowed his head at the approach of acquaintances who asked too loudly about Lena's prospects. Marriage offers dwindled. Men who had once admired her stitching now spoke to her mother about dowries and arrangements, as if Lena were a problem to be solved or hid rather than a person to be courted. Bry, her younger sister, folded her compact frame into a constant orbit around Lena: protectiveness and adoration, a twin thread of shame and fidelity. Lena learned the measures of her altered body in the slow syntax of stitches. Needle and thread became a way to practice patience and a way to listen. Sewing paid the bills. It was an honest, quiet work that let her arrange the world into neat seams. She became known for blue silk repairs that seemed to render a garment whole again, as if she could mend not only fabric but the ragged edges of a life. People admired her skill. They admired, too, that she had run into the smoke. They softened their voices when they addressed her. Their softened voices cut more than any old wound. 3 years moved like a hem being folded, long, steady, done with care. Lena learned to walk with a cane that Marcus had crafted from an old staff and a piece of iron he bent into the shape of a wolf's head. Ornate and awkward, a little ridiculous, the way pride can be. The cane felt like a part of her. She practiced steps in the back room of the stall, listening for the rhythm of her footfall, learning to keep her weight balanced so that nobody could see when the knee pinched and pulled. The town stopped asking how she had been almost before she could answer. They assumed they knew. They called her an omega in hushed, puzzled tones, an old word that by custom named those who moved with a steady calm in storms. In Lena it meant gentleness and a certain readability, a capacity to notice. People used it as both compliment and containment. The scars were visible, the pale webbing where flesh had knit across a tendon, the slight tilt when she sat. The scars that whispered were worse. They taught her to watch, to listen not just for the obvious lie, but for the slip of shoulder when someone attempted to fake comfort, the tiny delay before a smile that meant calculation rather than joy. It became a kind of work. She saw truths that others missed. She read faces the way she read fabric, quickly, deftly, like a seamstress finding where a pattern had been matched wrong. So it was not entirely surprising when a parchment arrived with the royal seal pressed into wax, an invitation to a banquet at the king's hall. Surprises came in different guises. For Marcus it was a demand. For Lena it was an affront and an opportunity braided together. The invitation was couched in courtesy, an honor to the merchant's family, the king's desire to see the people who kept the markets alive. For people like Lena, an invitation was a door. Behind it could be pity or a place to hide, or perhaps an opening to a world where the eyes of nobles might, for once, be taught to see differently. Her mother wanted her to refuse. "Sit this one out," Elena said, her hands moving as if she could sew the decision into the tablecloth. "It will be better if—" Her voice dropped at the last, the old fear of spectacle thick as molasses. Father argued the opposite. The family could stand to be seen beside someone of a royal favor. He saw the invitation as a small mending for the merchant name. But Marcus's pride had a brittle edge. He worried, too, that a scene might occur that would undo whatever careful dignity they had preserved. Bree, bright and stubborn, took Lena's hand and squeezed. "They invited us because we feed the city, because we are respected," Bree said, as if respect were a badge she could pin to the hem of her dress. "They invited you because you saved lives. Be the proof of that." She said it mostly so she could be braver outside of her sister's shadow. The truth was, Lena wanted neither to be an emblem nor to disappear. Lena felt a pinch of something like anticipation and a thrum of nervousness that threaded through the steady count of the cane. The gatehouse was a cavern of shadow, and when they passed under the arch, the world shifted. Torches lined the hall and threw patterns across stone. Servants in muted livery flowed to and fro, murmuring like a river. A steward, an unremarkable man in a clean doublet, took the invitation with a careful bow and led them to a waiting room where the fabric of the day curled around them. It smelled of beeswax and clean linen, a smell that contravened the market tang of Lena's life and made her feel slightly foreign in her own skin. In the waiting room, Lena noticed a mounted portrait of a man she would come to know as King Caden, broad-shouldered, eyes like river stone, and a half-smile that could be permission or judgment depending on its tilt. There was a weight to that face that did not need pomp to make it heavy. Alongside the portrait hung a smaller panel showing a wolf, its fur nearly black, its eyes pale, and the image struck a chord in Lena she could not name. People in the city told stories about the wolves, about how they moved like shadows that understood the breath of the world. They were living proof that a king like Caden did not trust symbols alone. He surrounded himself with something that spoke in body language rather than rhetoric. When the steward led them through a corridor into the main hall, the sound changed. There was an orchestra of murmurs, the clink of metal on metal, and a distant swell of music. The hall itself was wider than any room Lena had known. Long tables shone with polished wood. Candles blistered in sconces, throwing a warm amber over faces. Tapestries hung like curtains of earth, and the ceiling arched like a rib cage. People were arranged in tiers, a living architecture of station and habit. Florals tucked into braids, embroidered sleeves. Every hand that lifted to the goblet was measured. Lena felt the press of eyes as a physical thing. It brushed against her like wind over a hollow. She settled at a table with people from her district. They were merchants, knife-sharp and watchful, glasses held at the ready to toast at the king's signal. A woman across from Lena leaned forward, all coarse curiosity. "They'll be watching you," she whispered, not unkindly. "Make them see you're whole."
Lena wanted to say she was not a thing to be seen whole, not an object into which anyone should pour suitability. She smiled instead and let the music rise around them. Her observant eye kept busy. The slight wrist angle of a man who drank too quickly, the false ease of a noble's laughter, the muscle twitch that meant eye contact was an economy, not an intimacy. In the hush between announcements, she noticed the seat at the high table, a raised dais where the king settled and where eyes rolled to find him as an axis.
She found within that movement an energy she recognized, an unforced authority, a gravity that did not need to shout. "Lena Ashford," someone said then, by way of introduction. The room stilled like a hand closing. A noblewoman turned, a blade of silk and dyed velvet, and looked toward her with a practiced appraisal. Lady Vivian was what town gossip called a gilded thorn. Her dress was a formal armor of sequined darts. Her hair was arranged in a way that made its perfection its own declaration. Vivian had the face of someone used to having the room arranged around her appetite. She smiled at Lena as if she were a small, amusing inconvenience. Vivian did not address Lena, not yet. She only tilted her chin and made a small simpering noise at a joke someone at her side had made. But her eyes were sharp, quick knives. Lena felt them against her like a cold hand. A moment later, Vivian stood and, with that deliberate languor nobles used like a lance, sauntered down the table. She passed near Lena, her skirts whispering, and let fall a comment that was both casual and planted to explode. "How brave, that market girl," she said out loud, loud enough for the circle around Lena to hear. "So lovely to see common courage dressed in blue." It was a small thing, and small things stacked into storms. Lena felt the room tilt, the laughter like a curtain pulled too fast. Instead of flinching, she noticed the little spike of glee at Vivian's mouth, the way some nobles turned their heads away to hide their enjoyment, the protective clench in her father's jaw. Her hands tightened on the hem of her skirt. The cane, stored by her side, brushed the stone floor. She considered speaking, answering with wit, with deflection, but her breath shortened. Her knee protested with a sharp, hot ache that hissed up her leg. For a moment, she lost the steady metronome she had kept for 3 years. Her foot caught on the hem of her dress, a traitor seam she had not foreseen. Time contracted. A crowd of faces suffered a brief horror at the sudden imbalance. A goblet tipped and spilled. A candle's flame shivered. Lena felt herself fold in a way that was not graceful. She moved like a puppet whose strings had been cut. There was the soft, cruel sound of fabric scraping stone, and then the immediate animal reaction of the hall. A wave of astonished silence that broke into a chorus, some tender, some cruel, then laughter like a flock of startled birds. She hit the floor with the dull, shocking awareness of too many watchers. Pity, snickering, a few half-hearted hands reached out and then withdrew. Lena lay there, breath sharp, the taste of metal in her mouth from the sudden compression of ribs, from the sense that everyone had seen what they wanted to see. Her cheeks burned not from the fall, but from the realization that all the small strategies she had used to be unseen had failed. For those watching, her body betrayed a story they were eager to tell. The laughter sharpened. A ripple of whispers ran like cold along the backs of men and women who had come to be amused. Lena's fingers found the smoothness of the cane's wolf head and gripped. Her face flamed. She was not a child, and yet the hall had made her so. She could have stayed there, let it be over, let their pity sit on her shoulders like a too heavy cloak. She knew, though, that some things required a response that was not silence. That night, in the waiting room before the banquet, she had decided to go. The decision had been a small act of defiance, an assertion that she would be present, fully, and not be folded away. She had not anticipated the blade of Vivian's cruelty. She had not anticipated the sound of laughter erupting like small rocks dropped into a pond. Someone stepped forward with the intention of offering a hand, an unsure, clumsy movement that signified courtesy. Others shifted to pretend to look skyward or pressed napkins to their mouths as if to hide their glee. Lena's vision narrowed to the patterns of the tapestry near her head, to the hem of the dress she had mended with her own fingers. She tasted the old metallic fear that rose whenever a crowd considered her an object. Then, before despair could cement into resignation, the hall changed its breath. The music stumbled, and the air tightened. There was a sound like boots that were too large for their owner walking on wood, and then a measured descent of someone who did not habitually hurry. Heads turned in unison toward the dais, where a presence cut the lamplight. He was taller than most men, even seated, broad-shouldered and long-limbed, leaning into the simple fact of his size rather than announcing it. The king's cloak lay over his shoulders like a dark river. When he stood, the silk whispered, and the wolves at his side, if the tales were true, seemed to lower their heads. King Caden moved down from the dais with a strange, unhurried patience. He stepped into the nearer light, each movement purposeful but not theatrical. He was not the sort of man to be flattered into action by her fall. The city's stories had always added a rumor of rumbling laughter to his name, but what walked into the room now was not thunder. It was an economy of action that carried weight. He walked like someone who had learned to take measure of things before deciding to split them. His gaze landed on Lena with a calm that felt like being placed under a careful lamp. He saw not the performance of the hall, but the person on the floor. There was no indulgent thrill on his face. Instead, a faultless attention gathered. He moved quickly after that, not with the haste of knights, but with the unavoidable certainty of a wolf closing a gap. His hand reached for Lena with the simplest possible politeness. He knelt as though he were not a king performing mercy, but a person offering it. The movement redirected the room. Vivian's lips tightened. Those who had laughed shifted, ashamed at being caught mid-cruelty. The orchestra stilled into a single chord, the kind of silence you can feel press against your sternum. For an instant, there was only the rustle of cloth and the soft sound of Lena's breathing. The fall had been a spectacle. His action rewrote it into something with new meaning. When he offered his hand, he did so as if offering it to anyone else in the hall, a practical, unadorned courtesy. He did not make a show of rescuing her. He did not turn pity into theater. Lena took his hand because she wanted to. The decision was hers. She allowed the trickle of warmth from his palm to settle into the top of her own. The contingent of nobles inhaled and exhaled as if an old ritual had been restored. They lifted her with no flourish, no lifting as if she were fragile, but rather as two bodies finding coordination. When the king stood, he did not tower in order to intimidate. He simply straightened, and they were, for a moment, a picture of two people of very different station extending basic human courtesy. The wolves, who had been dozing on the dais, sat up at the movement. A dark muzzle appeared where a head had been. A low breath brushed the air like a comment that needed no translation. Their presence at a king's side was a reproof in itself. There are lines in this court you do not cross. A woman at the table near them, cozy with her own sense of propriety, cleared her throat as if to refocus the assembled. "The king's evening will continue shortly," she murmured, voice like a cloth. Her attempt at decorum landed with the soft clatter of silver. Vivian's smile froze.
Lena felt the current of eyes redirect from her to Caden, and then scarce to 1,000 other places. Her face burned, part shame, part a small fierce satisfaction that the room's narrative of her could be adjusted. She was not a token. She was a person who had made a choice to be present. When the steward approached with fresh goblets, Marcus's hand landed on Lena's shoulder. There was a pressure there that meant pride and relief and, perhaps, the beginning of a reconciliation between a father who had hidden and a daughter who wanted to be seen. Bree's face split into a grin that could have been a bay of victory. In the swell that followed, somewhere amid the rustle of fabric and low conversation, Lena felt a subtle new possibility appear. The world could be different if people chose to see differently. This is the moment, the small doorway of choice, when a person can step forward and let a life alter. Lena tightened her grip on the cane, as if to remind herself that this was movement on her own terms. If you love cinematic fantasy romances with slow burn connection and characters who mend more than clothes, if you like stories where dignity is reclaimed stitch by stitch, subscribe and stay with us. The rest of the banquet will show you what happens when a king notices what others thought invisible.
They led her toward the dais, not to the high table, but to a seat closer to the center of the hall, where she could see faces without being isolated like an exhibit. She moved with a steady, measured gait. The music swelled again, and the orchestra resumed as if someone had pressed a pause button on breath. Lena found her seat and folded the cane across her lap, a small carved wolf of iron bright against her skirt. At the dais, a pair of wolves, massive and sable, ears alert, watched her with animal patience. One of them, a dog named Cloud, according to the murmurs from servers, lifted its head and let out a sound that was almost like a greeting. Lena's fingers brushed the hem of her skirt, and, unthinking, she reached out under the table with the side of her hand. Cloud's fur was a thunder-soft thing. The contact was a private punctuation. For a flicker of a heartbeat, Lena felt understood by a creature that required no explanation. That sensation of being met, of a creature acknowledging you without pity, traveled through her like a small, clear river. It was dangerous to put trust in a glance. She had learned that. But she also knew that some things, the book of a person, were read slowly and in private, and that sometimes a single gesture could alter a room. From where she sat, she watched Vivian approach the dais like a parade. Vivian's eyes flicked past Lena as if testing the room's power balance. She was dressed to carve a shape into memory. Her lips formed words that flew like knives when she met a friend at the king's side. At first she struck a pose that looked polite, and then, like a blade concealed, she let loose a laugh at something she said. The laugh carried and found Lena's ears. It hit her like a stone. Lena's skin tightened. She felt old fear like a shadow at her back. Around her the hall adjusted its attention. There was a hush around the dais as the king, who had been speaking with a counselor, paused and turned his head slightly as if checking a map. The room inhaled. Something was about to happen. Lena's breath caught like a trapped bird. Outside, the city's lights shone against night like a gauze of tiny fires. Inside, the banquet continued, sharpened by the presence of those who made history and those who tried to become it. Lena sat with the taste of iron at the back of her throat and the weight of decisions pressing at her shoulders. The texture of the cloth under her fingers felt like a ground. She could not know what the night would hold, only that the moment had shifted, and that a new pattern was being sewn, one that she would stitch her life across whether she wanted to or not. The hush after the king's hand had steadied her lasted only a breath, before the room realigned its priorities, wine, song, gossip. But Lena felt the tempo inside her chest change forever.
What she had expected to be a single ugly night became instead a room full of choices, and one of them moved toward her like a quietly offered stitch.
Vivian recovered from the rebuke with the practiced speed of someone accustomed to reforming a mask. Her smile was thinner. Her skirts did not rustle with the same light arrogance. The air around her carried now the brittle undertone of someone who had been clipped. She made a show of smoothing her gloves, as if she found the king's small courtesy a stain she must erase from memory. The others inclined to her. Nobles who had depended on the sport of the small muttered and looked to the dais for permission to continue their amusements. Permission came not as spectacle, but as an invitation to dignity. King Caden did not make a speech about charity. He did not cast Lena as a parable for the room to digest. He rose instead with the economy that had announced him earlier. No proclamations, only movement, and extended his hand. He asked her to stand not as one asks a trophy to be presented, but as one asks another person to share a step. "Would you dance with me, Lena Ashford?" he asked, voice low and even, a voice that smelled of rain on stone and old barley. It would have been easy for Lena to refuse, to let the humiliation settle, pack itself around her, to return to the familiar safety of the shop and the small private patchwork of her life. Yet something in the lift of his hand felt like the honest option. The choice seemed simple and true, to take his hand or to leave the night as a wound that would properly fester. She rose because she had chosen to be seen that night. She rose because being helped did not equal being debased. She rose because the cane in her hand had become part of her vocabulary, a punctuation she could set down if she wished, not a shackle. They moved to the open floor. The music took them, a slow reel that let the room breathe around them. Walking beside the king, whose stride swallowed more space but never made her seem small, Lena felt the hall hold its breath anew. This time the scent was not pity, but attention transformed into respect. Hands that had once laughed now folded at their sides. Vivian's face had a red-hot color of humiliation. She drifted pale as a cut flower. The dance itself was careful choreography more than courtly flourish. Caden led without making a show. He matched her footfalls to her rhythm, not his. When Lena's knee tightened as they turned, he shifted his center so the movement took some of the weight off her. It was an act that could easily have read as patronizing, but the way he arranged his hold, light, steady, precise, made it feel like a mutual arrangement, an artful balance that respected both of their bodies. When she smiled, small and private, he gave a little half-smile in return, not grand, nothing to be read from the dais and repeated in gossip. It was a gesture that belonged to them.
Afterward, before the hall erupted into the ordinary noise of eating and court politics, Caden guided her away from the glare to a small sitting room off the dais, a room with low light and a window that let in the sound of the city. A pair of wolves, slimmer than the daisy beasts, more alert, lay across the hearth. Cloud padded forward when she entered and let her brush his forehead in an unassuming, intimate way. The fur was warm, real in a world where so much was theater. He sat across from her without a throne between them. "You mended a child's life and earned a scar for it," he said simply. "You do not owe courtesy for scorn. You owe the truth." There was the sober bluntness of a man unused to small talk. Lena felt a quickness, a test perhaps, or the sort of appraisal she returned to others. He watched as though he wanted to catalogue the exact way she breathed, the way her hands responded to a cup. He asked about the stitches on her wrist, asked not with idle curiosity, but with the careful interest of someone who wanted to know how the seams had been put back together. When he offered her work, an appointment at court as an observer, a truth reader whose task would be to watch, to record, to advise, he presented it as matter of fact. "The court thrives on appearances," he said. "Often there is a difference between what is said and what is felt. You see seams. I would have you find the places where the seams are being pulled apart." He spoke without the synthetic warmth that courtiers used when they wanted to make an ask seem like a gift. His eyes held an implicit trade: service for purpose, skill for a place at the table. The thought of living at court flashed across Lena's mind like a tapestry seen too close, too many threads, tangled hands. She considered what it meant: access, danger, the loss of the quiet that mending had given her. There would be political pitfalls, whisper campaigns, the daily parade of nobles who might use her existence as a weapon against each other or against the king. But the offer was not charity. It was a recognition of capacity. In a voice that had become practical under years of measured hardship, she asked, "What do you expect of me when I say yes?" His answer was no less measured. "Observe. Speak plainly. Tell me what you see. Nothing more." He named a modest salary, a room near the council chamber adapted for her, no grand promises of titles or lands. It was pragmatic, and it left Lena room to refuse if she wished. That freedom was the smallest gift of dignity. She accepted because she wanted a role that matched the truth of her body. Not a cure, not erasure, but a place where her skill mattered. She chose to take his offer as she had chosen to step into the smoke years before, because the stakes were clear and the act was purposeful. That choice would become, later, the axis on which everything else turned. Their first weeks in the castle were a graduate course in adaptation.
She discovered not a thief, but a meddler, a junior clerk in the steward's office who had been pocketing single pages to fabricate debts and then sell the silence for small perks. The motive was petty, greed and the desire to play a larger role, but the effect could have been disastrous for a servant. Lena presented her notes to Caden with the quiet confidence of someone who had reconstructed a garment's tear. Show the pole, the thread that ran wrong, and then the place to stitch. They confronted the clerk in the steward's office. Once the facts were laid bare, Merrick's name was cleared. He returned to work with his head higher, and the steward was made to answer for lax staff oversight, not for theft. The resolution was small but public. It taught the court there was a cost to assuming narrative over truth. It taught Lena that the discipline of watching, translating micro-expression into forensics of motive, could save lives and livelihoods. It taught the king that he had not been wrong to offer her a place. There were more complex cases ahead. One involved a well-known noble who had been accused of taking bribes from a grain merchant. The noble, Lord Halver, sat high in the council, silver-threaded and practiced. These were the cases that cut through a kingdom like a poorly threaded needle. Evidence could be faked, coins could be planted, loyalties could be bought, reputations pulled like taut fabric. Lena spent long hours unpicking Halver's public persona. She watched the man at council, the way his eyes diverted from direct questions, the small tremor in his right hand when he mentioned trade routes, the way his laughter came late and mechanical. She tracked the grain bills, traced shipments on paper to small port warehouses that bore someone else's mark. She followed the money, not by pretending to understand ledgers she had not been trained to read, but by watching behavior. The late visits to a merchant's house, the house's sudden flowering with wine and song, the clerk who signed off on shipments and then took a new mistress. Through patient observation, Lena found the seam Halver had hoped to hide. A ledger misfiled, a clerk who had been paid enough to forge paper but not enough to keep silent. The outcome did not come as a dramatic showdown. Caden called Halver before the council and presented the case with the quiet authority he favored. He did not point a finger and roar. He set the facts like needles on a cloth. There is a bill here, there is a ship manifest there, here is the clerk who changed handwriting like a seam ripper, here is the noble who nodded when the line bent. Halver was fined, barred from certain posts for a time, and made to account publicly for the schemes.
It was a degradation to his pride, not a public execution, and it satisfied the sense of justice without feeding the court's appetite for blood. The repercussions were political, reputations were trimmed, the mechanisms were reset. Not everyone liked the reset.
Rumors swelled. A pamphlet, unsigned and crude, began to appear in the market accusing Lena of being a royal spy, a tool to bring merchants under the crown's thumb. Someone left a bundle of suspicious letters at her shop, letters that implied old allegiances and old fears. It was part of the work of those who wanted her removed, smear and isolation. Lena faced it with the slow, exact patience that had become her craft. She let the king's open defense do what it needed to do. Caden, publicly and quietly, praised her work in council. He never boasted, he simply acknowledged her competence. That public acknowledgment was a blade that cut through slander without need of spectacle. Vivian, furious at the king's rebuke and irritated by Lena's elevation, tried to orchestrate a scene that would return Lena to a figure of shame. She pushed a narrative at a dinner, contrived stories stitched together for effect, suggesting that Lena had been allowed to the court only because the king prized the sentimental theater of the poor. It should have been petty. Instead, because Lena refused to be baited, the exchange exposed Vivian's pettiness to the subtler eyes at court. When Vivian pushed too far, making a veiled accusation about Lena's worth in front of other nobles, Caden intervened, not by striking down the woman, but by removing her privileges. He forbade Vivian from speaking at several public ceremonies and ordered that her seating be relegated at the next gathering. The punishment was social and public and apt. It cost Vivian status and the opportunity to perform. She was not exiled to a violent end. She was administratively punished, made to incur the cold social winter of a fallen favorite. Vivian's fall from grace was exactly the sort of public political repercussion the sword of the court could manage without blood. She seethed and rage-breathed, but she learned the edge of the king's restraint. Social consequences, reputational losses, and the removal of small privileges both humiliated and agitated. It sent the message that Mockery wielded as sport could be paid for in quiet administrative currency. As Lena's tasks grew, so did the nature of the problems she handled. A case of a falsely accused handmaiden, a conspiracy to frame a servant in order to cover for smuggling, and a scandal at the docks involving falsified shipments. Each became a thread Lena took into her hands and slowly reknotted. The framed handmaiden, Anya, was accused of stealing a necklace owned by a noblewoman who had disappeared. Anya's story unraveled under the weight of assumptions about servant womanhood. Lena spent nights sitting in the kitchen watching Anya's hands while the clock ticked and the silverware was washed. She noted the subtle way Anya's fingers rubbed a mill scar when nervous, a mark Anya had gotten years before from a millstone during a childhood fall. Lena cross-referenced the marks with a scrawl of handwriting found on a scrap that referred to a woman with a scar at the fourth knuckle, a strange and unlikely detail to fabricate. It led Lena to a gardener who had been paid in coin to plant rumor, and to the noblewoman's friend who had been hiding an engagement in shame. When Lena put the small parts together, finger scar, signature quirk, a thread of expense, Anya was cleared. The noblewoman had stolen her own necklace to hide an affair and then invented the theft as an excuse to remain unexamined. The public revelation did not come with fanfare. It came with quiet apologies and daily workmen's heads held higher for the truthful outcome. Lena learned that her work at court meant unpicking lies that preyed on those with the least power, and that seeing seams taught fairness. In these routines of justice, the wolves were constant. Cloud remained her companion, soft in the mornings when she would sit mending a sleeve and feel the dog's breathing warm on her knee. Titan would station himself like a column, radiating a calm that made even the most hawkish guard think twice before veering into cruelty.
They were sentient presences with personalities distinct as any courtier. Cloud's acceptance had a particular quiet that calmed Lena when court gossip sourly crested. He sat with his head against her leg during storms and when her knee pulsed with its old tender pain. It was not sympathy that made the wolves meaningful, but constancy. They did not perform for anyone, they simply were. The king's own loneliness, which had once been a rumor whispered over ale, unfolded for Lena in slow, unlocking conversations. He had lived a long life, long enough to see several generations pass, and the weight of extended years sat like a map of gray in his face. He spoke to Lena with a candor he did not afford others, of the burden of rulership, the strange isolation of being surrounded by people who served a crown rather than the man beneath it. Lena listened as she had been taught to listen, with the exactness of someone who read seams. She did not offer glib remedies. She offered instead the equilibrium of honest company. "The wolves have taught me more about governance than our books," he said one night as they sat at a long table poring over petitions by candlelight. A pile of petitions sat between them like a tiny mountain of human trouble. The wolves lay at their feet, breathing low. They know who belongs where. They test loyalties with a nose and a glance and don't get distracted by the flash of a promise. "You trust them," Lena said, studying the curve of his hand as he turned a petition with the precision of a practiced clerk. "I trust what I can measure," he corrected gently, "and sometimes what you measure, Lena." Their partnership moved slowly out of the offices and into personal, intimate spaces, not of sex or dominance, but of mutual reliance.
They shared small meals in the king's private garden, where Caden favored simple bread and cheese rather than the flamboyant feasts of his court. Lena showed him the rhythms of mending, how a restitch could let a seam survive another season, how a broken hem could be reinforced rather than recreated. He, in turn, showed her maps, routes of patrols and grain shipments, the administrative crust beneath the ivory of court life. Their relationship deepened not because he pulled her from need, but because their tasks crossed. His governance needed a truth reader. Her vocation needed a place to exercise itself. The palace itself softened around Lena's needs. A long ramp of gentle slope replaced a set of stone stairs near the council chamber. Handrails of smooth elm took the place of cold iron at the hall entrance. The servants, who at first had watched her with the same curiosity the market offered, fell into new rhythms. They learned how to pull a chair close, how to fold a footrest. Adjustments were small and practical and carried the grace that said, "The world must stretch to include those it holds dear." Over time, the court began to recalibrate. Merchants and artisans whom Lena had known previously came to the palace bearing small samples for her to inspect. They saw her not only as the woman who had run into the smoke, but as someone whose eye for a seam could save a guild from being swindled. Apprentices arrived, young women and men with rough fingers and eager eyes, asking to learn her skill of observation and noting. Lena taught them how to read the lay of a shoulder, how to watch the quick flicker behind a noble's smile when he lied, how to translate microtells into evidence the king could use. She was not simply an observer. She became a teacher, and her pupils carried her methods into new corners of the realm. Yet not all resistance faded. Politics has a way of pushing against edges. A small cabal of counselors, jealous, fearful of an unelected observer disrupting their quiet buys and deals, began to push back in waves of rumor and delay. They softened her petitions, refused to file reports, or redirected inquiries to other offices to bog them down. One man, Counselor Gareth, was particularly adept at bureaucratic stone-throwing. He had enough influence to stall an inquiry for months, and when that happened, the very people Lena tried to protect suffered. Lena responded to this more difficult, grinding opposition with the same methodical patience she used to fix a mangled sleeve. Step by step, unpick, expose the hidden stitch, iron it flat. She organized evidence in ways that became harder to dismiss. She worked with a clerk who trusted her to set up a chain of custody for documents, ensuring they could not be misplaced. She learned, as a result, the craft of pushing on power without invoking the king's might, using law, witness, and the slow construction of pressure to achieve results.
In one such instance, a road contract meant to fund repairs after a spring flood had been inflated to benefit a private ally of Gareth. Men in the villages were promised wages and never saw coins. The roads remained cracked while pockets were filled. Lena shadowed the contract signatories, followed the small payments to an artisan shop, and found a ledger that Gareth's agent had altered. The evidence tied the conspiracy together and forced Gareth to public accounting before the council. He weathered the scandal with a bruised ego and loss of office influence, not a death sentence. Such consequences, public and administrative, clarified the rules of governance. Throughout these political maneuvers, Lena's family life evolved. Marcus, who had watched his daughter be both heroic and humiliated in the market, found a new fashion of pride. He rose early to go to the docks and carried letters she had written to guilds with the same blunt kindness he had once reserved for merchant matters. Elena came to the palace more often, not as someone who shook with embarrassment, but as a woman who placed small jars of herb balm in the king's apothecary, an unspoken sign of gratitude and connection. Bree, who had once orbitally protected Lena, grew into her own person, apprenticed as a minor clerk in the palace records with a sharpness that matched Lena's. The sisters settled into rhythms of affection and irritation in equal measure, a normal, real domesticity threaded into an extraordinary life. As Lena's reputation grew, something else shifted, the way she viewed her own body. The cane remained an ally, the scarred leg still flared and sent sharp messages when the weather turned or when she had overtaxed herself. There was no miraculous undoing. But what had once felt like raw exposure gradually settled into a new self-knowledge. She knew her limits and valued the adaptations and friends who permitted her to move through the world gracefully. There were nights when pain crowded the edges and the wolves lay close like a covenant. There were mornings when she could stand and not think about the old fire for more than a single breath. It was not cure, it was life remade, function restored, in a manner that respected the truth of loss. And love, if it can be circumscribed into one word, grew in ways dignified and deliberate. It began in small things, a hand left for her on the rim of a document, a wolf-dampened footfall beside her chair during a long meeting, a moment when the king folded his cloak over her shoulders because the night wind had risen and the castle stone bit. They moved through intimacy with the same careful negotiation Lena had demanded in every other part of her life. When they first kissed, it was not a scene for the court, but a private sealing. Lena had to undo a knot in the king's cloak, his chin low, and the gesture moved into a hush. She gave consent with a hand on his sleeve, the motion clear and steady. There were times when questions of power hovered like dust in the sunlight. He had the authority to take or to give. She had the right to step away. It mattered both of them honored those dynamics. Caden demonstrated restraint. He did not purchase her affection with titles, nor did he insist she accept the full symbolism of being the moneyed king's companion. He offered instead equal parts respect and presence. He asked. He listened. When he proposed, it was after a season of shared work, not as a remedy for pain or a balm for pity, but as the union of two people who had slowly decided their fortunes matched. That proposal was small and private, a morning in the palace garden, blue silk like a pocket of sky caught in her bag. The garden bloomed with roses trimmed under watchful hands, and a bench sat under the shade of an old apple tree. Caden's voice held the same steady craftsmanship that the court had watched when he cut a piece of policy apart.
"I will not promise to change what you are," he told her, folding an open palm toward his chest and then to her, "because a marriage built on erasure would be a shame. I can promise to notice and to use my place so you may do your work, to stand beside you and to be with you by choice. Will you marry me?" Lena considered the words as if culling a pattern from a length of fabric. There was no rush to her acceptance. She felt the way a seam must be aligned before it is stitched. "Yes," she said finally, and her voice carried a tidy solidity. Her yes did not come from needing rescue. It came from desire and a recognition of the life they could shape together, an alliance of mutual choice, not a fairy tale of curing. They married within a season, in a small ceremony that resisted court showmanship. Only a handful of guests attended: Marcus and Elena, Bree with her ink-stained fingers, a selection of stalwart merchants, a few counselors who had proved their worth, and the wolves, calm and dignified, arrayed like guardians. The dress Lena wore was a modest blue, patched in places as a way to honor the life that had made her. Her cane leaned by the doorway, as a practical thing. She did not hide it. At one point in the ceremony, the king took the cane and tucked it at his side, in a way that was not a surrender, but a sign of solidarity. When asked if he would care for her, he answered that he would, and then, with a small, deliberate lift, he asked if he might sometimes carry her when she desired. She laughed at that, not from need, but from the small pleasure of being offered a kindness that was not obligation. "Only when you are asked," she said. Their wedding night was not gilded in secrecy. There was no sudden transformation of Lena's body. The scars were still visible, and the legs still remembered the stairs. Instead, there were small, everyday vows: to listen, to remain honest, to keep each other's counsel.
They built a marriage that respected choice and consent, where help could be given and received without erasing autonomy. It became, to those who watched with different eyes, a model of partnership. After their marriage, Lena's influence made room for structural changes. She proposed a program to train apprentices in careful observation, what she called stitch reading, and the king approved it. They created a guild of observers. Apprentices learned the fine points of noticing the slack in a shoulder that indicated fear, the twitch of an eye that masked a lie, the small economic tells that betrayed corruption. The guild offered paid apprenticeships to those with limited means, and prioritized those who had been overlooked due to injury or poverty. Lena's programs included practical adjustments, workrooms with low tables, apprenticeships that accommodated different bodies, and a fund to help families adapt to accessibility standards. She wrote petitions to local guilds and negotiated with counselors to appropriate seed funds. It was not a sweeping policy that solved everything, but it seeded change. Small things multiplied. One of the more tender results of Lena's program was a summer apprenticeship for Bree, who had long wanted real work rather than being forever the sister who ferried messages. Bree's fingers were quick and her mind hungry. Under Lena's patient teaching, she became an asset to the guild. Marcus, who had once worried that his daughter's injury would blemish the family name, now walked into the guild's rooms with a pride that softened him. He sat with the apprentices and told them stories of market days and of the shine of good leather when it had been properly mended. The kingdom changed in modest, measurable ways. Markets were safer for those who had once been seen as easy prey. Guilds took on apprentices from small hamlets. The court learned to equate visible injury with human dignity rather than spectacle. The wolf's presence at public functions became less a symbol of the king's ferocity and more a symbol of protection that included the vulnerable. Cloud, who had once been the dog who approached Lena with a soft sound, was now the dog who sat by apprentices while they learned, as if blessing the work. Not every victory was public. There were setbacks, petty revenge, delayed reforms, a resentful noble who refused to pay a repair invoice until the king's pressure became unmistakable.
Gareth continued to throw administrative stones, attempting to slow measures with the kind of small malice that wears thin a person's patience. Lena discovered that the work of reform is a crawl. It is a line taken a stitch at a time. It required the kind of tenacity she had always had as a seamstress and a survivor. One winter, a letter arrived that reminded her how close the old flames still lay. It was from a small village where a house had burned. 2 children were dead.
The handwriting was shaky and apologetic and demanded nothing. It was simply a report. Lena felt an old terror rise like smoke in her chest. She sat at her table and probed the memory of the heat that had taken that night. Burning wood, the way the world goes orange. And she found that, though pain remained, it no longer arranged the whole of her. She wrote back, offering aid and assistance, and arranged for apprentices to travel and teach safer hearth-keeping and how to manage older smoke-stifling chimneys. The letter did not change the world, but it let her take some measure of action that had the reddening of guilt softened into the utility of repair. Soon a year passed, and the memory of the banquet stretched back not as a wound, but as a seam that had been stitched into a new garment. People in the city told a story, that once a girl with a crushed leg had walked into flames and come out with 3 saved lives. That later a king had noticed her, and by choosing her had sent ripples through the court. Children asked Lena to tell the story of the fire and how courage was sometimes the act of stepping forward into danger. She told it plainly, leaving out bravado, including the messy human bits. She emphasized that courage was a choice, and that, often, practical help mattered more than praise. Years later enough that the blue of the dress that had once been a symbol of her visibility had faded into a softer color, Lena stood by a window in the guild room, watching a row of apprentices at their benches. One of them, a thin-limbed woman with ink beneath her nails, looked up and gave Lena a practiced nod, half greeting, half question. Lena felt at that moment a quiet satisfaction. She had not been exalted into a saint or made into an allegory. She had been given purpose and had chosen to use it. When people told her story, they emphasized different parts: the dance, the fall, the king's public rebuke, the appointment. Lena preferred to think of the long, unglamorous daily work of noticing and repairing. The wolves, always present, moved through the narrative like punctuation. Cloud grew old and gray at the muzzle and began to sleep where the light pooled on the guild-room floor. Once, when a child asked why the king kept dogs like those at his side, Lena answered simply, "They are family. They remind us how to be honest with one another. They do not pretend to be more than they are." The court, too, made changes not only of policy but of custom. Where nobles had once used mockery like a pastime, they now tasted the social costs of cruelties made public. The punishments were bureaucratic: loss of seating, temporary stripping of certain honors, and fines paid to repair public amenities. Those consequences did not transform human hearts overnight, but they taught the room that petty cruelty carried a price. The king's restraint had been deliberate. He did not want to crush his enemies. He wanted them to understand that a dignified society is one where the vulnerable are not fodder for sport. When Lena and Caden were older and public events grew fewer, the little domestic rituals mattered more. He learned the exact way her hand curled when her knee ached. She knew when to fold his papers so they would not crease his long-fingered thumbs. They sat on winter evenings by the fire with Cloud's descendants, telling lies to the younger wolves and to each other. They did not pretend the years had not changed them both. Caden with his silver threads, and Lena with the slow softening of a scar. But they had chosen a life where choice and tenderness coexisted. At the center of the story remained the idea of two kinds of scars. On an afternoon near the end of Lena's life, in which she still moved with the cane and still felt the old pangs, she addressed a small group of apprentices in the guild's sunlit room. Her fingers moved over a piece of blue silk she was teaching them to mend. She said, "There are scars that shout. They make a scene. They are visible in the skin and the gait. There are scars that whisper, inside, quiet, the ones that make you measure your step before you say a word. It is not the shouting scars that prove who you are. It is how you sew yourself back into the world." When asked what advice she would give to someone who felt pitied instead of seen, she paused and thought about the slow way a hem is folded and stitched, and then said, "Choose what you will offer the world. Do not accept pity as the only form of attention. Seek purpose. Patch the place that needs mending, and then find people who will learn that the new seam is no less whole than the old cloth." In the market and the palace alike, people began to tell another story, of a king who did not use power to humiliate, but who used it to defend. Of a woman who walked with a cane and taught a generation how to see. Children would sometimes run their hands over the wolf-head pommel of a ceremonial cane displayed in the guild's room, and announce bravely that they wanted to be observers. The institution that began as a small apprenticeship grew into a network of guilds across the realm, each with someone trained to notice and to speak truth. When Lena grew old enough that steps became an undertaking, she still walked in the garden to the bench where Caden had once proposed. On that bench they sat with hands knotted and Cloud's great-grandson asleep at their feet. They spoke less than they had once had to. Their conversation had grown into a shared silence that was enough. One day, when the sky had the clear, thin light of late autumn, Lena rose with an effort, and, such as it was, leaned on her cane. The king offered his arm not out of duty, but as a habitual, cheerful courtesy. He had never done anything grand to buy her love. He had chosen daily to be steady and just. It was a devotion that required no theater.
When the time came for Lena to step into the long night that comes for all, the court did not fret into melodrama. They remembered different things. They remembered a girl who had run into the smoke. They remembered a woman who taught apprentices how to notice the small tells that made courts honest. They remembered a queen, if that was the title they chose, who walked with a cane and kept a guild for the overlooked. They spoke sometimes of the banquet. The tale of the fall and the dance became one of the things people told, but it was woven into a larger cloth. Her work, her choices, the apprentices and the reforms, the wolves that remained family. In the end, what lingered was not simply a story of pity repurposed, but a lesson about agency. That being helped can be chosen, and that choice changes everything. Help, given and taken with consent, does not erase a person's life. It can make room for it to be lived more fully. If you have watched Lena's story and wish for more slow-burning tales of court and pack, of careful justice and tender love, like and subscribe. There are more patterns to examine, more seams to mend together. Years later, the account of Lena Ashford would be taught in small guild rooms and by firesides. Children would learn that courage is sometimes day work, stitches in a hem, steps taken despite an aching joint, the steady practice of noticing. They would learn that a king could choose to wield power with measured hands, and that wolves could be family, not instruments. And they would learn that scars, both those that shout and those that whisper, are part of the cloth we wear through life. What matters is how we mend them, how we move forward, and how we let others see us whole without making us into stories for their entertainment.
The final memory, for those who told it, lingered not on the banquet's laughter or the fall, but on the small, quiet thing the king did that night after the court had hushed. He knelt, as he had in the hall years before, but this time he did not offer a hand for spectacle. He offered it for steadiness. Lena took it, and they walked on.